What's up, dudes? Max here. Before we jump into it, I wanted to let you know about today's sponsor of the video, which is NZXT, as they've been my hardware provider for many years now. NZXT has several end-of-year deals going on right now, so if you're looking to upgrade, they got killer deals on award-winning Canvas gaming monitors and their best-selling H510K series for custom gaming PCs. As usual, NZXT likes to keep it simple with their gaming PCs, with their top in-class components, 2-year warranty, as well as very transparent pricing, and you can choose your parts to select from exclusive custom builds in the NZXT Creator PCs, which are featuring WD Black storage for accelerated low latency gaming. If you guys want to take a look at this stuff, head over to nzxt.com right now to take advantage of these year-end deals. What's up, dudes? Max here. So we're coming to the year's end. There's a lot of stuff that happened in 2022, but I think it was kind of an interesting year for fighting games specifically because we are in this sort of fascinating in-between moment. And while quite a few games did come out this year, there's also the looming giant 2023 on the near horizon that is full of a metric ton of giant, massive scale AAA fighting games that we've been waiting, well, a hell of a long time for. But I feel like these times in between present to us unique sort of fighting game titles that fill out these in-between gaps. It reminds me a lot of the mid-2000s, where Street Fighter and most Capcom fighting games were gone, and it allowed other franchises and companies to really pick up and establish themselves when there wasn't like the big top-tier stuff going on, especially between what Bandai Namco was doing with Tekken, as well as the Guilty Gear series and many others. These moments are kind of important because, once again, we did get some pretty great fighting games this year, in my personal opinion. And even though I didn't play absolutely every single one of them, I think between the few that we're going to talk about, there are some interesting examples we can set here of where the industry is kind of going and what's going to happen in 2023 with some of these titles. So let's get started. Here is my top 5 fighting games of 2022. A lot of you guys might be arguing this one, but I'm gonna say it deserves a spot on here. It's definitely better than something like Sifu. While not technically a fighting game, I can't ignore the fact that I had an absolute metric blast of fun with this game. It's an interesting spin on an already established, very populated battle royale genre, and it's Rumbleverse. I think Rumbleverse does deserve a spot on this. It does feel like it is mixing different things between platforming and combat and battle royale, but at the same time, there's a ton of fighting game roots in there. While it is obviously like RPS heavy, and a lot of fighting games have sort of been very rock, paper, scissors heavy over the past many years now, I don't think that's a detriment to it. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of items. There's a lot of interaction, and just the fact that battle royale as a natural sort of occurring genre is something that allows for so many interesting weird moments, then that's what makes Rumbleverse great. That's kind of what makes fighting games great, in my opinion, too, is that you collide all these mechanics and all this crazy stuff, and all of a sudden you get these results that are unexpected and wild. I think Rumbleverse is one of the best examples of that. So even though, while not technically a fighting game, I do think it's something that's worth a nomination, and I do think it's one of the more interesting spins on the battle royale genre that we've had in a very long time. I think the only problem with it is that it got updated a lot, and this isn't really the issue with, you know, fighting games, much less BRs or anything. It's just the games as a service sort of, you know, method of distributing games. It's hard to keep up with this stuff, and it's a free-to-play game, so you have to be constantly like on the ball when new updates are coming out, new seasons and stuff like that. I actually have not had a chance to play a lot of the latest season and the latest map because there were so many other things that were coming out at the time frame, and the meta has now drastically changed. While that's not a bad thing, it is something that makes it hard to keep up with, whether or not it's a fighting game or any games as a service sort of title. So am I going to be coming back to it? I think I am at some point. It's just, as of right now, there's so many other things that I'm like focused on and I'm excited about that I'd prefer to sink my time into. The other one was a release that happened earlier this year that we actually had a tournament for on Twitch. You guys might remember the Capcom Fighting Collection, which is one of the first Capcom collections that's been released in quite a long time. I think it might have been like 4 or 5 years since the last Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, where it featured a ton of titles that were released throughout Capcom's fighting history, but not specifically focused on just Street Fighter. So we got some really interesting titles like the Darkstalkers series. Almost every single Darkstalkers game was in there. We also got weird games games like Cyberbots and stuff like that. There was a lot of really fun stuff in there that had not been released or shown, and stuff that we thought would be lost to time, like Red Earth and things like that. What I don't want to talk about is the individual quality of each game. While like I might not be a huge fan of like Red Earth specifically, I think most of the games in there like Darkstalkers and stuff like that and Puzzle Fighter have nice little places in there, even though Puzzle Fighter isn't a fighting game. I think the quality of that collection is something that is worth mentioning, because once again, we can already consider so many other Capcom fighting games that are out there that should possibly get a release in some kind. And this felt like a sort of test for that. While not like insanely huge budget, they did have a lot of considerations. A lot of those games were remade in a way that allowed you to have select options that weren't available in the previous game, either bugs or fixes that happened later on, and they just let you choose that like right out the bat. From what I understand, an internally made Capcom fighting collection. And most of the Capcom fighting collections we run into, much less Capcom collections of any kind, were outsourced to other companies like Digital Eclipse or way back in the day Iron Galaxy. These folks made amazing collections for Capcom fighting games, but this was the first time like Capcom's actually doing this stuff in-house, and I think it was made on RE Engine, which is also fascinating that it can port games as well. So that's cool. The nice part is that it did have proper online connectivity. The netcode was pretty dang good, but the arguing part of it is that nowadays it's becoming more and more hyper aware to players when there's nobody online for these select games. And Capcom Fighting Collection suffered kind of hard for that because it did not have crossplay. Now crossplay is starting to become a standard, thank God. I can't believe it took us this long to get here, but we're here, and if games do not have crossplay, and if they're not super popular fighting games, it's starting to get pretty obvious. So I think Capcom's kind of in an interesting spot right now, where clearly there's other titles like the Marvel vs. Capcom series, as well as the 3D fighting games that absolutely deserve the sort of attention that these games got in the Capcom Fighting Collection. And while these games weren't as crazy popular as you would like to think, they were given a huge amount of love, care, and attention, which makes me really excited for the future if they do stuff like this. I hope it's not once again like a test. And even the dudes at Capcom have said that they're no longer like testing the waters like the Darkstalkers Resurrection Collection to see if like we should release games like this. The sales of old games directly impact the sale or creation of new games. No. That's not the way it works. I just hope that there was enough response from this, from something to happen in the future. I hope this actually enables more collections of some kind, because if that's the thing that a lot of us would like to see, give us the Project Justice games, give us the Plasma Sword games, try to get the old licenses to like the Street Fighter EX games, put them on a collection. That stuff will be super popular. So I got to give big props to Capcom Fighting Collection. This was one of the first times we've seen Capcom directly in-house create a collection of classic fighting games, and it felt like they really gave a shit. Okay, so my third spot goes to Multiversus. And while Multiversus didn't end up being a game that I put a ton of time into, I have to give it a lot of credit. Multiversus did establish a precedent of what a fighting game could be if you truly shoot for the free-to-play model complete from the inception of the game to the actual execution and launch. Even though I still think they're technically in beta phases right now, Multiversus is a game that they tried to fully go the free-to-play route, and did it work out for them? Technically, I think the impact of Multiverse at launch was absolutely huge, and from what I understand was pretty industry changing, where people saw how much attention that game was getting, at least in its first month or so, and it definitely turned some heads. Where Multiverses ended up going, and is it a game that everyone eventually likes, I think is still up in the air. For me personally, I do think it deserves a lot of credit for trying these things, but it was a game that I just never eventually like gelled with. It has like all these interesting gameplay mechanics and Smash-like stuff and everything like that. I just never found a character that really intrigued me. I never found like a reason to continue to play, and I've heard some gripes and minor things from people about the online connectivity of the game, that eventually over time, when there was limited player base and everything like that, even though it is a cross-play game, that some of the connection issues started to rear its head. So what I will say from my experience, where I put the most time into it in the first like month or two, it seemed pretty fantastic, man. It seemed like, oh wow, so they got this rollback netcode thing down, they got the ability for 2v2, they got like classic franchise characters. I do think all that stuff helped to make Multiversus launch huge, but as of right now, it's not nearly as big, and I think that this eventually boils down to, this was supposed to be a free-to-play Smash successor. But the funny thing is that there has already been free-to-play Smash successors that have sort of happened and are like accessible and free-to-play and stuff like that, and that's like Brawlhalla. And even now it seems like Brawlhalla has a longer active community base over time because it's been huge forever. It feels like it even has more active users right now than a game like Multiversus, which kind of spiked really hard and then evened out and then teetered down. And I wonder if it's due to gameplay reasons. Once again, I play the Smash games and platform fighters strictly from a super casual perspective. I'm just here to have fun with this stuff. I definitely feel like this is an interesting take on what a Smash-like can be. I wonder if everybody's going to like this, right? And I think for me personally, there was never one individual character or one specific thing in the game, which I personally need, that kept me invested and kept me going and wanted to get better and keep queuing and ranked and all that kind of stuff. So I think Multiversus is going to do just fine. I think, once again, being a free-to-play title, also being a title that is going to be continually updated for like years to come, I feel that they have a big future ahead of them. And this kind of happens with most games where they get this immediate spike of popularity, free-to-play or not, and they sort of have to figure out, well, how do we balance our audience from this point forward with continual content and updates? How do we bring people back? And that absolutely is one of the most defining issues, especially when it comes up to some of the next games that we're going to talk about, of fighting games in total. And what 2022 has essentially done is made me realize, and made most of us realize, that the majority of fighting games that come out are just popular at the start and then they just go downhill. And very few games are able to keep that popularity going forward. And unfortunately, it seemed like Multiversus is one of those games that sort of did that. Hugely popular, industry-defining stuff. So many people, they're making so much money. It's absolutely crazy. And now you really don't hear or see much about it anymore, even though there has been relative continual updates and stuff like that. I think it takes a lot to keep any game, not just fighting games, in your personal like zeitgeist, in your perspective. And it feels like Multiversus is sort of like trying to find its moment and figure out what it wants to do. So while I do give it credit, it's a good example. Someone had to eventually like dip their toes in the water and have like a very large scale, big IP, free-to-play fighting game sort of thing. And I think it's going to help the industry a lot going forward. But once again, Multiversus needs its time to shine, and it feels like it's going to get that later on, just not as much as the absolute crazy launch that it had earlier this year. My number 2 spot goes to King of Fighters 15. And I do think this is absolutely one of the more notable fighting games that came out this year. KOF's a game that has such legacy and has been around in the community, much less the fighting game scape, for so long, that any big release of a KOF is a huge deal to a lot of people. Maybe not the insane like audiences that you would hope that it would have. I wish it did. But it was absolutely an update to the formula of King of Fighters 14 that was needed and very much more polished than what we had before. Granted, I'm a huge stan of KOF 14. Like, I tend to like get behind the backs of games that might not look visually great but play really well. And I felt like I fell in love with what King of Fighters gameplay is in KOF 14 specifically. So while I did put even more time into that game than KOF 15 at this point, 15 refined all of that, where it's like, oh yeah, we're just going to do these things that worked really well in KOF 14 and just make them better. Stick more characters in here, change the art style, do all this stuff, and we're going to see if it catches on. Did it catch on? It's really hard to say. All I can say is that I talked about this a bit before. There's some fighting games that come out throughout the years that I'm really excited about, and it has characters that I think are great and are fun, and the gameplay's fun. It's like a hark back to classic fighting games. That's why people really like KOF 15. It feels like an old school fighting game. But at the same time, did it manage to make the impact that I think even other fighting games might have, like Samurai Showdown? I don't think it did. And I don't think it specifically comes down to visuals. I don't think it specifically comes down to gameplay, even though KOF 15 technically is a harder fighting game than most fighting games that have come out in a while. I don't even think it really boils down to any of that. I think it really comes down to content. And that's something that we're realizing with a lot of different fighting games that have been coming out this year, especially the next one that we're about to talk about. If your fighting game launches with essentially like bare bones content, your chances of grabbing a casual community is extremely small. Now, once again, my perspective and this perspective of a lot of people you hear about KOF 15 is that it is great, but that comes from a hardcore community. That comes from people that really like KOF already, or people that are already invested in fighting games, stuff like that, which is fine. However, once you add the fact that there's an issue with how much stuff you can do in the game technically, right? Between outside of like arcade mode type stuff, there really wasn't much. And then you take the online issues. While this is the first time SNK has released a big first party, right, new release fighting game with rollback netcode, it did need to get figured out. I feel like the first couple weeks of the game's netcode was okay, but not great, and they were still obviously figuring out how to make rollback work really well with their game. The other issue was obviously the matchmaking, and I can say without a doubt that this was the thing that eventually got me to stop playing. Its ranked modes were fun, and they did have a nice progression of rank, but getting to champion happens kind of fast, which is the maximum rank. The biggest issue was that the only way that I could eventually play people was by getting into like lobbies and stuff, because the ranked would just not find people. There is a solution to this. Online matchmaking is going through a huge change that is coming up next year. So technically we're getting an update to KOF 15 that is changing its matchmaking and also allowing for crossplay. And I do think crossplay will have a pretty big impact, especially between the PC version and the console versions, because there was already some issues with the console versions and everyone just jump shipped the PC, which is usually what happens with hardcore audiences in fighting games. I hope that this is the opportunity that KOF sort of gets to sort of come back and have people realize that, hey, you can actually look for matches and not find people that'll just destroy you. Because the weirdest situation I had when I was playing KOF and relearning how to play the entire series, obviously, and getting better at it, I would find people and they would feel like they had never touched a controller in their life. And I'm like, this isn't providing that much of a challenge that I'm looking for, and you would just win, and it's not hard at all. And on the other end, you would run into people that felt like they had been playing KOF 15 for the past 30 years of their life, which makes sense. It's a legacy fighting game. But the weirdest part about it is that there was almost nothing in between. The only way I can find things in between where it felt like there are people that are kind of as good as me, like figuring out this game, played it a bit in the day, only way I could find people like that was quite literally in player matches. And I just had to hope that eventually we found somebody that was of that sort of skill level. So that is a problem. Like, I have a lot of patience when it comes to this stuff. I've been running into online ranked and fighting games and finding people that are insanely good or bad or around my skill level for a long time, so I kind of know how that goes. But there was just a huge disparity in KOF 15's matchmaking that made that kind of a tough pill to swallow, and it seemed like a lot of people still are echoing those problems still to this day. It's a fantastic game. It's super fun. It doesn't have a lot of content. It's got a ton of characters, but you really need to know if you're dedicated to that. This is the kind of game where it's like, yeah, if you put in the time, you're going to absolutely love it, but do people want to put in the time? And that's the issue with most fighting games nowadays, is that you have to get people to fall in love with it first, instead of telling people that they're going to love it eventually. And that is a reality that I don't think many devs have sort of grasped. You have to find things that people can do in the game that'll eventually like find ways to make them love the shit out of this franchise, or love the characters, or love the mechanics. Because if you just have an arcade mode that just shoots basic combo trials and that's about it at you for the majority of its content, and then the rest is play online for the next 4 years, it's getting more and more difficult unless you have an already established huge franchise like a Dragon Ball or a Tekken or something like that. It's getting more and more challenging for fighting games to get their footing if it doesn't have that stuff. So once again, I think KOF 15 is an insanely fun game. I think it's going to get a lot better with that update in 2023, but it was pretty clear the challenges that it had when it launched, and most of those challenges still have not been solved even till right now. And the last game, and my #1 game of the year, why do I always do this to myself? I always pick the most controversial game that people either love to hate, hate to love, love to hate love. It's friggin' DNF Duel, all right? I can't help it. Like, this game was so much fun to me, and I really enjoyed my time playing online. Did it burn up really hot and bright, like a tiny rock flying through the atmosphere? Yes, in my opinion. At least the game looked great. It had a lot of characters that I kind of liked, right? I'm not even a huge dungeon fighter fan. I just sort of liked like the way the character designs looked in the game, to the point where like this game felt like it was what I wanted Grand Blue to be, if that makes any sense. And it seemingly is getting better, but there was a long time in between there, which is another testament of how people perceive fighting games and what we've come to expect, where several people like DNF, right? Where DNF came out and it was fun and people enjoyed it, and some people obviously didn't. But clearly, there was a practical radio silence for such a large amount of time. It gave the impression that the game is done. It gave the impression that, oh, it looks like Nexon or Neopol or whoever the heck put in the money for this didn't pay for anything else, and that's it. And it makes me realize that everyone feels like the game's dead because they're not saying anything. But as players, as people that invest into a game, if you don't get a dedication of like commitment going forward, it immediately instills this like this disparity amongst your player base that like, oh, well, this is the whole game we have to play. There's nothing coming in the future. And even though that wasn't the case, there was such a long period of time, it created such a negative stigma about DNF Duel that's going to be riding the game to this day. It doesn't even matter. Even though it just got a patch, even though I think the patch is pretty fun, it buffed everybody technically, but also created like a game that is still kind of similar. It's funny, there's a lot of things that DNF did that I have to talk about that are things that people request and even I've asked for in the past. And does it exactly work out that way? It's not black or white, you know? But I do really like this game. I feel like DNF has some truly fantastic and interesting characters that are really cool. There's only so much you can technically do with them, but its systems are at least fascinating enough where you have to burn your gray health to sacrifice or risk your life to do more damage. Like, okay, I see where this is going. The problem was at the start, only so many characters can do that. Only so many characters get access to those tools and can actually modify that stuff. The one thing I always wanted DNF to do from the first betas that we played, which was back in like 2021, I wanted the game to have more mobility. It was a game that seemed to give the characters a lot of tools and very powerful options, but weirdly, you know, forced everyone into a situation where you just kind of had to hold this shit. And it seems to still like be that, and it stayed that way all the way until the latest patch where they finally changed some defensive/offensive mechanics. They made the roll a lot faster and activate a lot quicker. So the roll is actually kind of effective for getting out of pressure situations like ranged attacks and stuff like that. It's good. I feel like it's a necessary change they needed to do, but possibly even more. I do hope that this game eventually opens up what characters can do mobility-wise, because grounded movement, running, all this stuff is big commitment, man. And it's weird that you have a game that has so many powerful tools on all these characters, and almost everyone in the roster outside of the very fast, like Kunoichi Swiftmasters, are pretty dang slow on the ground. So I would like to think that they already did one thing. They already changed the balancing of how we can move around with rolling, because rolling was pretty rough in the early version of the game. I hope that eventually carries over to different kinds of mobility later on. I don't think the game needs to become directly an air dasher. I just think it would be nice to match character mobility with all the nutty character things you can already do. And this game is another perfect example of what everyone constantly complains about, which is that fighting games are too hard. Fighting games, the motions attached to them, doing supers, all this stuff, there's too much finger dexterity that you have to utilize in order to make all the cool stuff happen on characters. DNF came out, and it has really cool looking characters and beautiful graphics and amazingly powerful special moves. And guess what? They're all easy as shit to do. They do not require any inputs. You can do them for a small reward, but for the majority of the game, it is a forward plus special button kind of game. Forward, back, neutral, down. That's it. So all the really cool stuff that the game sets up, all your characters' really cool attacks are dirt as shit easy to do. And what happened? It's actually one of the hardest fighting games to be good at, for other reasons. The fact that those tools that they give you, like the developers specifically made it that, hey, every single player can do these characters' most powerful tools. You can become amazing at this game and do all this ridiculously cool stuff right out the bat. But what happens? It's not the fact that the moves weren't powerful. It's not that the utility of the moves weren't there, or even the dexterity required, like the half circle, fireball back. It's like the opposite of King of Fighters, where people don't want to play KOF because, oh, the inputs are the problem in the game. Things are just too hard to do. Well, then play DNF. The issue is that no matter what happens to a casual player base, a very casual player base, the larger percentage of people that play the game, people see moves and they do not know how to use them. They do not understand what anti-airs are. They do not understand that this is a combo extender. They do not understand this. They don't understand that. And most fighting games don't put in the time to explain that stuff or to put in situational awareness that build the ability for you to understand, oh, I should be doing this here. I should be doing that there. So I think DNF sort of is the defining example of that. It's a game where everything is super easy to do and it's actually hard as hell to be good at. And for reasons completely outside of what normal people would understand, you can't intrinsically just give people tools and hope they use them in the ways you think they would. But for fighting game players, you immediately know, based on the history of fighting games that you've played and all that experience, yeah, I use this for that, I use this for that, and it's easy to do now. So what happens? It makes all the insanely powerful shit that you get available right off the bat. There's not even any learning process at all. And what happens to the new players as a result? They just get blown out, just absolutely destroyed. They don't understand what the hell's going on. They don't know where to block. They don't know what's going on. I think DNF is one of the best examples of that, where everything's cool. It looks amazing. It's powerful. It's easy to do. And guess what? It's hard as shit. So again, I think it's really exciting that the game is getting updated. I'm really happy about that because characters are getting new things, new combo routes are being established, new meta is being established because of the role, and we're obviously getting a season of 5 characters that's happening down the line, which is exciting and neat and cool. But do I think that this is going to be a thing that will cement DNF Duel as being, now it's got all this stuff, there you go, DNF Duel is about to be like the big fighting game? I think that's been passed, right? I don't think this game was ever going to be a giant release fighting game that was going to absolutely shake up the market in some way. But what it was, and what I'm happy about, is that it was a wonderful in-between game. It's a game that just happens and it drops and you sort of get to conclude whether or not you like this kind of game or not, and either leave it be or keep playing it. And for the time that I put into it, I'm glad that we got to nearly the highest rank. The last rank is just a huge slog grind. But at the same time, I really enjoyed that first month and a half rank from the absolute bottom all the way to the top. It was genuinely great. The problem is, by the time that was over, the top was very lonely. There was not many people left playing. I was playing against a very limited amount of players. And at that point, you run into the same exact problems as most fighting games like this one. There's just only so many people that are interested in the game at this point. So I'm excited for DNF Duel. I'm excited that this game's getting more continual updates, and it is actually my favorite fighting game of this year. Yes, the game that literally had Rock Howard is not my favorite fighting game this year. Believe it or not, it goes to DNF Duel because this game just gave me some of the things I've been wanting to see in fighting games, which is characters to have ridiculously powerful tools. Nothing in that game felt like, oh, this is a low impact sort of move. I'll have to figure out where to use this. Like, no, almost everything on every character felt good and like aggressively good and sometimes too good. So it's the perfect example of a fighting game where we're just gonna buff everyone and give everyone all this crazy powerful shit. And here's, well, that's what we got. So my number one fighting game of 2022 is shockingly DNF Duel, and that's probably going to piss a lot of people off, but it's just the way I feel. And is it going to be a game that I play forever? I think it's going to be a game I'd like to come back to, and it's something that always, I think, will have a lot of fun intrinsically built into its system. So yeah, I think it's one of those things that's just going to pop up on the channel every once in a while, like a Third Strike. Do I love it as much as those things? I don't know about that, but I feel like there's a bones to the game. There's like an established like build system that they can build upon and also make it a lot better than what we got at launch. So what I do have to say is that there's another list of games outside of my top 5 games of 2022 that I'm also really excited about. And the next time we get together and have a chat about it, it's going to be the giant fighting games of 2023 and beyond. And as we mentioned earlier, this was an interesting in-between year because right now the horizon of fighting games is looking absolutely insane. And there's still potential games that have not been announced, which also could be announced in 2023. Let's chat about that in the next video. Thank you dudes a ton for watching. If you like this list, or if you have a list of your own of your favorite fighting games that came out this year, there's a lot that I didn't talk about. Them's Fighting Herds came out. So many other things that were like indie-made fighting games did get a bunch of time this year. Go ahead and post them down below in the comments to let people know what else you could be giving a shot. These are the ones that I specifically played and put a lot of time into, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely everything, you know? Either way, thank you dudes a ton. I appreciate a thumbs up on the video. My name is Max, and I'll see you next time.